Our next speaker before the break is change of pace, really, is going to update us on a real measurement success story in government.
I can see clearly now, the rain is gone. I can see all obstacles.
Please welcome to the summit Elayne Phillips, Head of Horizon Scanning and Planning, Department of Environment, Food and Rural Affairs, Communications Group for the British Government.
Thank you. Good morning. Lovely introduction. Thank you. My name is Elayne Phillips from Horizon Scanning and Planning in DEFRA, in UK government based in Westminster in London. And what I'm going to talk to you about today is government horizon scanning. Some of you will have heard the term horizon scanning in the past. Most of you will probably think of it as something that's related to futurology. So, what car are we going to be driving in the future? Will it fly? What's the climate going to be like? What bugs are going to become extinct? And what sort of new and emerging diseases are we going to see coming over the horizon? And although that is incredibly important, a week is a very long time in politics. So for the purposes of horizon scanning in DEFRA, I look at the 0 to 18 months time frame. And what I mean by that is the emerging issues now, right up to predicting what we're likely to see within the 18-month period. We use horizon scanning as an evaluation and measurement tool in the Department of Environment, Food and Rural Affairs in a really very practical way, and that's what I'm going to talk to you about today. The idea being that if we can see what's on the horizon, we can react to that early and we can plan and mitigate if needed, and ultimately we can use it to analyse and predict and inform future government policy-making decisions and also our communication strategies that will support those. So first, to talk about sort of why the government horizon scans. As you can imagine, running the country is of interest to virtually everyone, regardless of the audience segmentation. And typically, if we get it wrong in government, we can be front page news. And that sort of the intelligence that we can gain from horizon scanning, if we use it well, it should inform our decision making, mean that we make better decisions in government, and ultimately make our messages land better with the public and stakeholders and various other groups. Now, it used to be that we could look at, you could listen to the radio, you could watch TV, you could read the newspapers to find out what was going on. But, the proliferation of media has meant that 24/7 news and user-generated content really is available, and we can tap into that, and it's never been easier to understand what the public mood is and the public angle on different stories and topics that are of interest. So across Whitehall, there's actually a really big push to use evaluation as a really practical tool to inform our decision-making. And you may have seen in PR Week recently and various other magazines, they covered this, because we're very much more focused now on outcomes than outputs. And I know everyone's using the same phrase, but it's really been driven home. And Alex Aiken, who's our new Executive Director of Communications in Government, is really behind this. And he's launched this new project worth £100,000 into developing and training all government communicators. There's about 1,500 of us that are going to be privy to this new Inspire programme. And it's really very comprehensive. So it's not just about training, it's not just about sending people on a course to learn about evaluation and great, that's it, job done. It's not that, it's about changing the structure of the department and how we're all evaluating. Part of that involves identifying best practice pockets across government as well and tapping into those. So where we're already doing it well, let's not try to reinvent the wheel, let's sort of learn from each other, partly what we're sort of doing at this summit as well. I'm really pleased to say that DEFRA and Horizon Scanning and Planning is leading the way in this field. So we are going to be listed in the next week or two when they publish it, the government communications strategy for the whole UK government. So that's a really sort of quite a bonus for us, and we're really pleased about that. But there's a long way to go, and everyone needs to work in the same vein. And the idea ultimately being that we optimise how we spend public funds so that we're really efficient as civil servants, that we're doing things that actually add value and save money. Ultimately, like everyone else, we'll be affected by cuts, and we need to be as slick and lean as we possibly can be. So what all this means for DEFRA and for my department is that because we've got one of the widest remits in government, and in fact possibly the widest remit in Whitehall, we've got 40 delivery bodies or so that sit beneath DEFRA. So if I just give you a few examples, you may have heard of Kew Gardens, Environment Agency, Forestry Commission, but you get the idea that ultimately we have a lot of delivery bodies that focus in specific delivery areas for our field of work. So if I give you a bit of a flavour for what that tends to cover, so if you take farming, for example, that's under the DEFRA remit. So covers things like dairy production, competitive farming, rural broadband, so can rural communities actually become digital by default in the first place if they don't have access to broadband? Subsidies, paying farmers subsidies from Europe to make sure that we're producing the right volumes and products across the UK. Food, really emotive. Everyone's got an interest in this. Food pricing, food labelling, food trade, genetically modified products, that sort of thing. So really quite emotive and sort of high-profile topics. Also things like pollution, air, waste, recycling, again, a broad remit there, including flooding, drought, hosepipe bans, some of you will be familiar with. And finally, things like animal and plant diseases that are either spreading across Europe and about to hit the UK, or have hit the UK already, in which case we need to contain them, prevent them, handle them in some way. So as you can imagine, this is quite a broad remit from a horizon scanning and planning perspective. And what our challenge is to evaluate this, use it as an analytical tool, and ultimately use it all to predict and use it in a horizon scanning way. So what have we done? Well, honestly, on analysis and evaluation, I could talk for 2 hours. I won't, Barry. But essentially, we gather loads of intel. We look across other government departments to understand what they're doing. We look at all the agencies that sit within those departments. So that can be anything from, Driving Standards Agency, Child Support Agency, Borders Controls, really sort of huge mix of things. And we gather all that intel together. We look across Europe and understand what the negotiations in Brussels are shaping up to be like. So again, we can start to understand what's likely to come out of those discussions. Typically, they'll be about sort of common agricultural policy, common fisheries policy, that sort of thing. But also animal disease and plant disease that are spreading across Europe. Quite often, they'll start at a certain location, and you can watch them geographically spreading across and over to the UK. Again, really interesting intel is to look at seasonality. So again, in the agricultural community, there are certain times of year, lambing season, for example, that lambing diseases are going to be more sort of at the fore. So again, we need to watch. And, in the warm weather, for example, certain tree diseases are going to come back because the spores will be released from the trees. And, then when the weather gets cold again, the fungi. So I won't go into detail, bore you with it. But, there's lots of different sort of pieces of intel that mean against a timeline, we can then help to predict what's going to happen. We also look at external factors here, and this is about very much understanding, well, what else is happening in the world? And sometimes that will be, for example, is there a big summit in Madrid about the environment this week? If there is there really any point in trying to get the one environment journalist that The Guardian has over to the UK in Westminster on the same day this summit is happening, because he's not going to be in two places at once. So it makes sense to understand what else is happening in terms of those external events, but also because sometimes those external events can impact on us. So, for example, I think every Boxing Day there's a fox hunt, and DEFRA gets drawn into the animal welfare related issues associated with it. So although it's not something we're doing, it's something to be aware of because we're likely to get phone calls from journalists. So with all that intel, we then filter it. And this is the bit where we start to really sort of map out from the smallest to the biggest piece of intel that we've got. And we start to distill that frenzy into sort of what's important, what's going to be reputationally a big issue for us, what's big for DEFRA in terms of what we want to promote and what we need to try to get out there in our messages. And we overlay that against the other government departments' plans, and we overlay it against what the experts predict how these messages will land, if that makes sense. So we have various different sort of experts within communications and policy, and we will gather all of those together to help us predict what the key issues are going to be. What they can also do is they'll have knowledge of how these messages potentially landed last year if it's a seasonal issue, or so the history to this topic, particularly some of the scientists that we have, which I'll mention in a minute. But we'll use all of this intel to filter it down into sort of stock takes. So if you take some of the key issues that DEFRA's got an interest in, we're able to snapshot some of those topics in one sort of easy measurement and metric. And that will include everything from media to social media to, how many calls has the call centre received, how many FOIs, how many journalist calls, how many web hits, how many stakeholder interests sort of points have we reached. So it's a really mixed bag of things that gives, per topic, a huge amount of data, but in one really easily digestible snapshot. And ultimately, then, with all of that distilled, we can work with Number 10, Downing Street and Cabinet Office to really use that timeline and overlay it with a political agenda, and we can start to then see whether this is all actually going to work. Is it going to map out well? There will be times where maybe the Chancellor will want to make a statement, and obviously news is going to dominate when something major happens politically. So we need to be very careful that we're not sort of trying to compete for news or compete for journalists across government. It makes sense to really strategically map that as best we can. With all of that in mind, this is me on a cold spring day a few weeks ago, going to Number 10, as we do on a weekly basis, to do that planning. And we do that horizon scanning. And what the point of all this ultimately is that so we can say, look, this is what we think is going to happen, and these are the things we need probably to do about it. And some of that will involve things like, well, we probably need to work with stakeholders. We possibly need to ask them if they will carry our message for us. We need to see if there's some sort of partnership arrangement we can put in place here that will work together, perhaps if there's an opportunity to do that. Equally, we can mitigate against any risks. And we can try to make sure that, when we are planning these things, that they actually make sense. So we're not going to plan things in and say, right, well, we think the Minister should update his peers in the House of Parliament on Tuesday the 14th, when actually Tuesday the 14th is already really full and we're not really going to get that date. So it makes sense not to work in isolation on any of these topics or plans, but to overlay it against the whole plan of what we're doing sort of across government. And that's really helpful when we get an unpredicted issue that hits us, because as we all know, best laid plans and all that. So we also are concerned with the emerging issues. And this is where we work really, really closely with Gorkana, and we use the radar system. We use it for two things. We use it as an analytical tool, which is helpful, but we also really helpfully use it as an early warning system. And we know that social media is a really, really fast-paced environment. We all know that. And what we use the system for is to alert us ahead of this ticking time bomb. The idea being that if we can know that something is starting to build in social media before we start to get calls from journalists and before it really starts to sort of hit this spike, then we can prepare ourselves. We can get policy officials into action. We can update Number 10, Cabinet Office, ministers if needed. We can start to talk to stakeholders early about sort of lining up how we're going to handle this, because sometimes we'll have a joint approach. And it just gives us that extra edge. And that can be just minutes, it can be hours, it can be days. But actually, it's so incredibly helpful. And this enables us to do this. We sort of think of it as avoiding saying no comment, because if we try to use traditional media in this example, so I don't know if you can all see this, but this sort of is probably running up to about 2 or 3 o'clock in the afternoon. But if we wait to get a press release cleared, we won't drop the press release until lunchtime, and we'll have missed the story. It's over. Reputational damage is done if it's been a negative story. Or worst, we haven't been seen to be engaging in the conversation, and we don't want to be absent from these conversations. A really good recent example was where the Minister met with stakeholders about forestry. We made a forestry announcement. And the stakeholders that sat in that room live tweeted the meeting. And immediately after that meeting, the Minister walked out and said, I need a social analytics report now, because he immediately needed to see what the translation and penetration of the messages that had been delivered was. Where were the gaps, and what did we then need to go out and tackle and try to get our further messages out there if needed. So it was a really, really a really good reinforcement, actually, of the importance and the ministers are placing on this sort of intel. I'll skip forward to what what do we call it? Well, we call it horizon scanning and planning. It's not Mystic Meg. We're not predicting out of thin air. We are trying to use a good solid intel base. Because in a nutshell, and I guess in summary really, is that we look at the past, we look at the current, and we look at the future plans. And the idea is that using all of those metrics, whether they be from other government department sources, whether they be from stakeholders, public, number 10, Europe, or just our own knowledge of what's planned and in terms of announcements and events, we will use that as a solid intel base. And we're really, really very lucky actually in DEFRA, because we've got the second most high-ranking scientist in UK government working with us. And so the base of knowledge that we have from a scientific and technical perspective is immense, but that's where it sort of comes back to the whole need for us to filter in the way that we do. And what we sort of end up with ultimately are I guess, dashboards, high-level dashboards. And these are daily. Sometimes they're actually 2-3 times a day, depending if you've got a major issue unfolding. But they're also monthly and weekly, and we use them as not just sort of that immediate early warning and quick reporting, but we then use it as those sort of predictive tools that I've talked about. These particular examples on the screen are particularly small, so that you can't see them, because if you could read the content, I would have to kill you. But as Marguerite made a really interesting point, and I really do echo this, is that there's such a need for uncomplicated metrics, because the people who are reading these are not experts. I wouldn't even call myself an expert, but the guys who are reading this, certainly at ministerial level, probably have about 15 to 20 seconds to absorb any one piece of paper. So this would be like a slide. They will look at it. They will literally have seconds to absorb. So we really have to get that point across quickly. It needs to be simple, and it needs to really tell the story that we're trying to tell. And what we try to do here is we let the social media and the horizon tell us that story. So we're not trying to drive it from DEFRA's objectives. We're trying to say, yes, we already know what DEFRA does and DEFRA's position, but actually this is what the public think the position is. So then we're able to compare the two. Rather than trying to let one influence the other, we're trying to let it tell a story in its own right. So if I do my job well, then this management information is used to help us be, to perform well and to be resilient, and ultimately keep our ministers and number 10 and Cabinet Office happy, because we can see clearly now. I'm not going to sing, don't worry. So that's it. Thank you, Barry.
Interesting, isn't it? We had Elayne yesterday say, keep it simple. We had Marguerite this morning say, keep it simple. And we've just had Elayne saying the same thing. So 3 clients. Good feedback for the room. Thank you. Right, let's go to questions, please.
Hi, it's Chris Shaw from Cometric. Elayne, thank you for your presentation. In order to keep it simple, do you actually integrate the information that you're getting back from the focus groups, from primary, into your social analytics? Because one can reinforce the other. Indeed, one can drive the other, vice versa.
Yeah, I completely agree. It can and it does. Some of the challenges that we face are that we can't do as many surveys and some public mood dip checking in the way that we might have done in the past, because they cost money. So what we're trying to do is do this in the most streamlined possible way that we can. I completely get the point that, you know, one will drive the other, and indeed we see that a lot. We'll often see actually, particularly with DEFRA issues, that either news will completely drive the social media and everything that follows within the horizon. So horse meat, a recent example of that. Everything that happened in the news was completely mirrored throughout social media and throughout our horizon scanning, although the content changed throughout. So it's very, very important for us not to just look at the volumes and just the metrics, but also to understand what the content is and what people are saying, because particularly, I mean, horse meat, again, is a good example of this. It started with sort of a certain angle about sort of, you know, the issue emerging, but then it soon sort of started to move to different angles of interest. So one was about sort of the standards within the food, then some were about the supermarket's involvement, and then it moved on to the costs, and then the levels of analysis that was happening within the various different food types. So actually it had a bit of a cycle in its own right. And then there are other topics that follow the normal trend. So the graph that I showed earlier, the line graph, that can be really, really typical of a standard announcement that DEFRA either puts out or an issue that we see hit, because quite often they're really, really so fast-paced that they're finished by lunchtime. So we have to be careful to be cutting edge and quick, and at the same time try to absorb some of that sort of longer term intel that's going to be helpful for us to predict. And we do, I guess, rely on some of our experts to know some of that as well. So we've got stakeholder experts that come to a lot of our predictive meetings, and they will come with knowledge of, well, actually, you know, this stakeholder is a little bit edgy about this particular topic, and they'll be able to contribute from that perspective as well. So we try to integrate that as well.
Thank you. All our speakers are going to be with us on the roof for coffee, so we're going to move for a coffee break now. So in thanking Elayne, which we will do properly in a moment, do please feel able to approach this morning's speakers. They've put a lot of effort preparing their slides, so they would be flattered by your interest. Elayne, thank you.